And this morning, our first speaker is Rob Ahlrichs. He's from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and PhD candidate. And he's going to be talking about some of the research that he's doing for his dissertation. Rob.
Got to speak in the ear. Okay.
Yeah, try to keep it close.
I'll try to keep it right up here. Perfect. I'm probably going to wander around, but I'll try to stay on it. All right, so let's do, already losing it here. Let's get that going. Okay, so my name is Rob Ahlrichs. I work at UW Wisconsin-Milwaukee with Bob Jeske. He's my advisor. And he is leading a number of grad students in archaeological investigations of the Lake Koshkonong area. He's been working there for, I think, 19 or 20 years now. And they do field work out there, mostly with Oneota sites. They've gone to a number of sites, excavated at 2 sites for sure, 3 maybe. Well, actually a number of sites, 3, 4. I just kind of keep thinking of more as I think through it. But so around Lake Koshkonong, he's really getting an idea of what's happening there archaeologically. And one part of the field work, being out there and trying to figure out what happened in prehistory, is getting to know the people who live there now. And so he'll go out to the bar, Norm's, and visit with the local folk that live there, because he's coming out of Milwaukee and doesn't know everyone. And one of the people that he met there was Jim Busty. And some of you know Jim Busty, and some of you know Jim Busty's collections. And so, of course, Bob was real interested in the large copper collection, and we were able to go out and visit Jim's house and get a look at his collection, and it was impressive enough that Bob thought maybe I should switch my dissertation topic over to looking at Jim's collection rather than what I was doing, which was looking at red ochre burials. So I did that. I was able to switch my topic over and start cataloging Jim Busty's copper collection. Jim had been collecting for, well, sorry, go back here just a second, just so you all know where Lake Koshkonong is, quite a ways from here, right on the southern end of Wisconsin. And you would be surprised, I was surprised, to know that there is a large copper collection down there that far south. And I'll get into just how large it was here in a second. But Jim's been collecting copper for over 70 years. The majority of his collection comes from Lake Koshkonong, though he has a substantial sample from some northern localities as well. He collected around Lake Koshkonong, but also went up, and I'll show you those places later where the other places he collected. One of them was on the Tomahawk River and around Lake Nokomis, and another one was on the Menominee River, amongst other places. Around Lake Koshkonong, he collected along the lakeshore and on some of his own property, which is real near the lake. These locations on the lake include both old copper deposits, stuff that's probably archaic in age, though Jim hasn't gotten anything radiocarbon dated, but it's got the old copper look and build to it. And he's got about 2,000 copper artifacts from Lake Koshkonong, and those are just the tools. That's not to mention all of the manufacturing debris that he's got from there. And then later, he owns some property where there's Oneota or late prehistoric evidence of human habitation. And from there's a lot of copper as well. There's quite a bit of pendants and beads, and of course lots of tinkling cones and awls. Those things seem to continue down through time. And my study is focused on just the Archaic era artifacts, and those were found more down near the lake, like right on the lake or in the lake, where he was collecting and metal detecting right in the lake there. So that's what I'm looking at. I wanted to go over just a little bit of an overview of the old copper culture, just because that's what a lot of this group is kind of centered around, is the use of copper in prehistory, and specifically the archaic use of copper during Archaic age. So one of the main things about old copper is that we don't really know what to call it. this manifestation of artifacts that we see in patterns from Lake Koshkonong up to Canada and all over the place. So we started out calling it an industry. This was Will McKern wrote an article in the Wisconsin History Magazine in 1942, and he was the first one to kind of publish on this is a culture that we need to study separately. So that's where it was first named. There was, of course, a lot of articles about copper and copper artifacts before that, especially in Wisconsin Archaeologist. That's one of my projects I've been trying to do, is go through every issue of Wisconsin Archaeologist and kind of note what they talk about copper in each one. And a lot of times they're just highlighting interesting copper artifacts or collections of copper. But it's interesting that old copper, our understanding of old copper is hinged on collectors bringing what they found, bringing it out and bringing it to academics who can get it published. So anyway, McKern kind of brought all of that together in 1942 and called it the old copper industry. He noted at that time that it was older than most of the known cultural complexes. He based that almost entirely on the level of patina, or how corroded they were, and that he correctly identified that these artifacts were probably made by people who hadn't discovered pottery yet, or hadn't started using pottery yet. So that was a pretty impressive inference for that time. So he pegged old copper as what we would now call archaic, even before there was an archaic and a woodland in a Mississippian time period. So that's good work at that time. Later, some people called it old copper culture, but this is maybe an optimistic name, overly optimistic name, and it was quickly critiqued on a number of fronts. One of the things is the dates seem to be too long enduring. Copper was used over several thousand years, and any one culture that is that old, well, there just aren't any really that are continuing cultures that are the same for millennium. They changed substantially over that time. The copper was too widely dispersed to be just one culture, and the artifact styles are really too unique to be from just one culture. So that nomenclature was kind of dropped, and we've settled in on calling it old copper complex. This terminology does leave open a lot of options, which is a good thing. We can identify the presence of the old copper complex through copper artifacts, but they aren't necessarily the central component of the culture of the people who made them. They're what we're very interested in, but the people who made and used them weren't necessarily interested in them in the same way that we are. Sometimes they are great works of art, but sometimes they're just useful. Sometimes they just get the job done. And so calling it a complex doesn't put too much emphasis on the copper part of it. There's lots of other types of artifacts that are found in association with utilitarian copper artifacts. Those things are made of bone and ground stone and chipstone. I'm sure that they made and used lots of other things made out of faunal and floral material. Different cultures to exist within the complex. So when you've got this really broad area where you find these similar copper tools, it's probably a lot of different, what we would today maybe term ethnicities, using that same technology, but they're very different socially. They're completely separate social units. And so we allow those different cultures to exist within the complex, and we can still study the complex as a whole. So that's helpful. It recognizes that understanding of the copper industry utilized by these people is important to understanding the people. So instead of just calling them archaic, we recognize that copper was a central or an important part of their subsistence strategy, of their technology systems, and so we can kind of focus on that as a part of knowing who they were and how they did life, their life ways. And then it allows for evolutionary change within the cultural complex without having to name each and every little tiny change as a new complex or a new phase or horizon or different culture or something. We can say, okay, that's all part of the larger copper culture complex. So, okay, so that's just an overview on how we named it. Now we call it Old Copper Complex generally. That's what we've settled on. Some dates of interest here. Looking at just a few resources, 6800 before present and 5300 before present from just one site. So it goes to show that over thousands of years at one site, these folks were coming using copper and then leaving and then coming back thousands of years later and using similar pieces of copper. And even if the dating is a little off there, it shows that there's a long discontinuous occupation in the Lake Superior region, and that is probably a good description of how these people were living. They're hunters and gatherers, they're moving around a lot, and they're taking their copper technology with them as they go from place to place. And sometimes they come back to an advantageous spot after years of being gone. And so these radiocarbon dates will help to illustrate that fact and kind of nail it down rather than it being just a hypothesis. We'll be able to say, yeah, for sure, we've had, there's occupations every 20 years here or 50 years or whatever. So that's just one. There's a date, we got a lot of Plager dates here from Menominee, Michigan. That was 6200 BP. The Oconto burial site was 9000 BP, so that's an extraordinarily old date. And those were, the Oconto burials were somewhat controversial because of their age, but Plager redid some in the 2000s and got the same ages essentially. So they're pretty solid dates. We think that those old copper burials were really that old. It's about 6,000 to 3,000 before present is the time frame cited by Plager and Stoltman in their overview of the old copper culture. That's kind of when we were at the heart of and the zenith of using copper for everything, lots of different types of tools. And you get some earlier dates, or later dates, I guess, between 4,300 and 3,000 at all these burial sites, which are the classic, or the type burial sites for old copper culture, since we don't have much for habitation sites with copper excavated. We really rely on these burial sites for their dates to know when these tools were in use. What we desperately need is a habitation site to be excavated and to get all of that contextual information, get dates from features that have copper in them, get dates from bones or hafting, things that are associated with stone tools and bone tools and all the rest of the cultural tools that they were using at that time. We desperately need that habitation site, but we haven't been able to find one and get it excavated professionally. So any help you all can give to us doing that, give to all of us doing that would be really, really helpful in figuring out how they were using this old copper. One of the inadvertent things that's happened with all these burial sites being the main place that we have contextual information about copper, is that a lot of professional archaeologists see copper as kind of an exotic material that's only symbolic in use. And I think most of us know in here that that's not the case. It was just another material used to do the work that needed to be done. And the only way we can prove that is to have some context for those tools with other utilitarian tools, with a habitation site. So that's something we're desperately interested in doing. This is just a little bit about the geography. This is Witchery's map from the 1950-1951 study that he did on distribution of copper. The dark spots are where like each dot represents an artifact. So the concentration of it was down there. I'd be very interested to talk to some of you about where you think those dark spots should be now. Or Okay, my one question here is this a hotspot for finding copper? Anybody? Yeah? There's still good stuff down there? Okay, so that hasn't changed. Okay. I was wondering, like, is that depleted now? Is there still stuff there? It's good to hear that there's still things there. Okay. All right, so anyway, I think we could put some more hotspots on the map right now, right? We could update that. Here's some later ones. Fogle 1963, we've got the kind of the spread from New York to Manitoba down into, somewhat down into the Prairie Peninsula, kind of getting Minnesota and Wisconsin in there and Michigan. Similar map here, similar map there. Since 1977, there hasn't been much of an update on looking at professional literature or academic literature or any published literature on where that line should be spread out to. So that would be another good thing to do, is take a look at who's found copper recently. Yeah, Jim?
Yeah, just a quick comment. Could you go back to that slide on the distribution right there?
Yeah.
One other thing I think, and I may be wrong, and someone else can correct me on this, but one of the things that I think that indicates also, when I look at the northern part of Wisconsin,
Yeah.
in very few sites there, or flying spots, if you want to call them that, 1950, I think that indicates farmland.
Oh, yeah.
So what is
Yeah.
it?
Yeah, for sure. It has a lot to do with population, for sure. And I have a slide later where it shows the collectors, where they're from, and it's like all on the
I
hotspots.
know that north part of Wisconsin is loaded.
Right. Yeah, and now we know, right, because there's a few people living up there, where back then, I mean, there was people obviously living here, but, yeah.
And when you're talking about finding copper, you're talking specifically about copper artifacts
Yeah.
or float copper too?
No, this is talking about formal copper artifacts.
Okay.
Yeah, and specifically old copper artifacts. So we're not including Oneota and Hopewell use of copper in this kind of stuff, and these maps especially. But yeah, we're talking formal copper artifacts for sure. Float copper, that would be another interesting one, and will have an impact on the Lake Koshkonong collection because there is some float copper down there, but not that much. So is it enough to supply an entire industry? That's going to be a question I'm going to have to answer for my dissertation. Anyway, so there's some geography on old copper. It needs to be updated. Maybe it's the same still. I don't know. Maybe it could be expanded a little bit. We'll see. All right. And then old copper diversity. Here's Witchery's typology, which I use just for its simplicity. And it's generally good coverage of the artifacts that are out there. It's most comprehensive. It's pretty simple. It illustrates how much formal diversity there is within old copper complex artifacts. For example, here's Witchery's projectile points, but then here's a harpoon point. It's a little tough to see. It's obviously a harpoon. Where are you going to fit that into that typology? It doesn't go anywhere, right? So there's socketed harpoon points as well. So are those different? Are they the same? How do they fit into typology? And it's okay that they don't. It just shows that there is a pretty massive diversity of copper tools, which probably means that it's not just one culture using copper and making copper tools. It's lots of different people using this material to solve problems and make a way in the world. Another example is there's a bunch of awls I'm going to get into in a minute. These are all different types of awls that I think are structurally different. They may not even qualify as awls because they're so different. There's something else, but that's it's wide diversity. Here's some of the different projectile point types in Mr. Busty's collection. Okay, we'll just keep going here. All right, so the Jim Busty collection, a little bit of an overview on that. I counted a total of 3,190 old copper artifacts in his collection. This did not include everything, especially the manufacturing debris, of which he has collected many pounds. He has quite the diversity of artifacts, highlighted by a staggering, okay, so those are his collecting locations, sorry. And then he's got a real diversity of artifacts, highlighted by 1,500 awls, or perforators of some kind. So fully half of them are the very exciting tool type awl. And I'm trying to catalog all of them. I've done a number, so I've done quite a few, so that's good. And it has turned out to be more interesting than I thought. They're not all just small sticks of copper. They have different forms and different shapes that I think are meaningful. And whether it's meaningful culturally or functionally, that's still something I need to figure out. But I just don't want to spill this on the computer. Okay. Let's see. So as you can see on Witchery's map, Busty's collecting localities do not really match up with any of the then known high concentration areas of copper. Again, we'll talk about where these hotspots would be, but Busty's collection certainly adds a couple of places where you'd have some dark spots there where there'd be a lot of copper artifacts from. For those of you who haven't seen Busty's collection, I'll just give you a bit of a slideshow here. These are his personal finds from Lake Koshkonong. They are a mix of ages. The beads there were found in an Oneota location. It's nice to have some of these stone tools that are definitely archaic in age, because that means we've got archaic age copper coming from those same localities. Sorry, I haven't been using this very well. Huh? And yeah, so this is more of his collection. There's all the awls. Some of these are in new collections now, new homes. That one particularly. There's a case full of very interesting types of artifacts. Some needles, which he still has. Okay, so that's just a quick slideshow. Now, one of the things we got to do is provide some context for these copper artifacts. It's nice to kind of go through the typology and try to figure out what they are and what they might be and what they might not be, what they might be used for. But with archaeology, we also want to get the human story, right? We want to learn how are people using these things, and why did they form such a large part of, or seemingly large part of their culture. So to do that, we've got to get the context, and so we've got to look at a little bit of environmental context. So the Lake Nokomis collection locality is at the southern extent of the Lake Forest ecozone. This means it was in a transitional zone between the high density of lakes found in northern Wisconsin and the more river-dominated ecozones of southern Wisconsin. This area is underlain by Precambrian rock, which is the source of the copper that we all know and love to study, but this also precludes the availability of chert for tool stone use. So there's a lot, at Lake Nokomis, there's not direct deposits of copper, but there may be more float copper up there, but there's not any chert, and if they're using chipstone tools, they were doing it out of quartz for the most part, or trading for chert. Let's see, so above the Precambrian bedrock, there's about 150 feet of glacial land features, and these are still immature in their development and erosion, and since there's all these big, essentially dams of dirt from the glaciers on the relatively flat nature, or the relatively flat upland, there's lots and lots of lakes there. So you got lots of groundwater, lots of fresh water, and so that kind of concentration of lakes really provides a rich environment for both animals and humans. So you get, it's relatively poor in large land mammals, at least herding land mammals because of the forest cover. But the aquatic resources would have been very, very, very plentiful. And you could do some hunting of solitary land mammals, and would have been an important part of the subsistence system. The aquatic resources probably would have been more readily available, so fish, mussels, and those kinds of things. And of course, all the plant resources that are available in watery environments. Lake Koshkonong is a little bit different. It's in southern Wisconsin. It's squarely in the eastern broadleaf forest ecozone. It's normally dominated by river environments rather than lakes. Lake Koshkonong itself is really just a wide spot in the Rock River. It's very, very shallow even today, and there's a dam that is controlling the depth of it. And so if that dam wasn't there, it'd be even more shallow than it is, and it's really just a wide part of the river, of the Rock River. But you do have some marshy area there. This area is underlain by Paleozoic sedimentary rocks, which has no copper available in the area, other than a little bit of drift copper, but there is a lot of available chert. So you've got that added resource availability there, at least to some extent. Lake Koshkonong is also controlled by glacial moraines. And there's low and high spots along the lakeshore, marking successive lateral or end moraines created as the Michigan lobe of ice retreated, or the Green Bay lobe. It may be the Green Bay lobe over there. Along each of these higher areas, there are archaic habitations. So what would have been hillsides at that time, there are archaic habitations kind of series along the lakeshore. And that's where Mr. Busty is finding his copper. There would certainly have been a higher volume of deer in this area than up north at that time. I think it's just be more open, oak savanna rather than pine forest. And aquatic resources also would have been very, very useful and abundant. It's thought that the difference in emphasis on aquatic versus land subsistence practices should have some impact on the type of tools that we find copper being made into. So the two localities are similar in that they're dominated by glacial landforms and controlled by lakes, but so it would have been a familiar landscape and kind of habitat package if a group of people were traveling from one to the other. They kind of would have felt at home there between the two, but there is a significant difference in the types of animals that would have been available, at least to some extent. Okay, so now to get into the actual artifacts here a little bit. How am I doing on time? Oh yeah, we got loads of time. All right, so Lake Koshkonong artifacts, so far I've looked at 461 of the 2,000. It's hard to say much about the assemblage level at this point since I've only looked at a portion of them. But from what I have looked at, we've got 38% of them are perforators, 26% were fish hooks, I think, yeah, and 25% were projectile points. I think, yeah, projectile points. And then the other 11% are made up of knives, heavy tools, and decorative items, and a few manufacturing debris that are kind of preforms or almost tools. So that's just kind of a breakdown of what found at Lake Koshkonong. Just getting into some of the details now. Projectile points. Here's the types down here. The IL, the L, N, and O types are all what we would call conical. The N type is the actual cone, where it's a circular cross section. The L and O types, I haven't been able to differentiate between them. The O's are supposed to be longer and skinnier. The L's are shorter and less skinny. But they grade right into each other. So there's just no definitional change between them. And then I've also found that really the ends aren't that much different either. Sometimes you get circular hafting with rectangular distal ends, or the bit end. And so what do you call that? It's not really a cone. It's got a square end. It's like kind of a half breed. So eventually I just ended up lumping them all together, at least for this talk, though you can technically differentiate them. The other type was the 1A1. Yeah, so let's see. So this LNO super type here makes up 87% of the projectile points from Lake Koshkonong that I've looked at so far. and only 13% were spear points that had an edge. So the other type was just the basic socketed, triangular spear point with a long cutting edge. Harpoons, they're the L and O type. Harpoons don't have a cutting edge at all. It's just pointy on one end and heavy on that end. And they're meant for stabbing. They're not meant for cutting anything, right? You're just trying to stab something and get it to stop running away from you. Whereas with the type A1 projectile points, you've got a cutting edge there that you can cut things up with if need be. Or you can stab things with it as well. It's got a pointy end too. Those are very difficult to differentiate. You can see there, is that round or is it rectangular? I don't know. Is it L? Is it too long to be an L? Is it too short to be an O? You know, what's the difference there? Not sure. Difference between spear points, or between points and spearheads, is cutting edge. That's an important functional difference, I think, where you've got a lot less cutting edge with these conical type points here. There's no cutting edge. Even with the ones that look angular, they're still very thick on the side. There's no cutting edge there. So if you calculate in knives and cutting edge spears, you still have a 4-to-1 ratio of things you stab with versus things you cut with at Lake Kashinok. So that's an important functional difference that anthropologically tells us something about what they were doing with copper. Okay, so it's just remember that 4-to-1 ratio of cutting to stabbing tools. Moving on to awls. So awls are by far the most abundant tool made of copper. I think that would be universal truth, at least in my experience. At least half of the tools in Mr. Busty's collection can be classified as some kind of awl, punch, needle, or perforator. Some of the more basic circle and square cross-section examples also seem to be a step on the way to fish hooks and other more complicated tools, though I had the thought this morning there may be a difference in thickness with fish hooks versus awls. I'd be interested to look at that statistically. There seem to be a number of different types of awls in Mr. Busty's collection. I hypothesize that each of these types represents significant differences in either manufacturing technique or function/targeted use for the tool. If the difference is merely manufacturing technique, then the differences are likely culturally controlled and unwritten rules of the community. So if it doesn't make a difference what the shape is, square or round, then you're going to make it the way that your people make it, right? I learned how to make an awl round, so you're going to teach your kids to make the awls round, and that's just going to continue generationally until somebody says, no, square is better, and then they'll switch it up and make them square, and then it'll go back and forth. But if there's a functional difference between those two shapes, then that will tell us something about what they were doing with them, which would also be interesting. If not, maybe we can look at the distribution of square versus round and see different ethnic groups, kind of idea here. So anyway, so here, these are examples of the types. Awls A1 and A2 there are defined by Witchery. In his typology, just one's got flat sides and one's round, all the way around. Type G is, it's bipointed like A1 and A2, but it's much flatter, has a rectangular cross section. And I find that the widest spot kind of moves around on the awl. Like sometimes it's down towards one's end, sometimes it's right in the middle. I don't know if there's a difference there functionally or not, but that'd be another interesting thing to answer. Maybe the short end is the hafted end, I don't know. I'd love to find some examples of these that would tell me that maybe in a little bit better shape, not so heavily corroded. Maybe you can see some evidence there. And then we get into kind of the weirder ones. Awl H is approximately square in cross section, and then it's got one curved blunt end, and then the other end is pointed. I mean, you're getting towards the dental pick there, but that's obviously not, pretty sure that's not what it is. So that's probably got some interesting function to it. All I has got a flatter cross sectioning. It's kind of like the G type, but it's not bipointed. One end is the tab, the other end is pointed. All J, Don was talking to me last night and said those were probably fishing gouges, and that would make sense. Sometimes that triangular part there, that projection moves around, again, like the wide spot on these. Sometimes it's on one end, or sometimes it's more in the middle. And I don't know, again, if that's a functional difference or not. But that'll be interesting to answer. And then there's some unique ones I get into here. So there's a kind of a stranger one. It's got that S twist to it. It's just like a round awl, but it's got this real, it looks to me like it's on purpose when you look at the artifact. So, you know, you just wonder what they needed to accomplish with that. And I have not seen any others along that line exactly. Here's another interesting one. This one's even more like a dental pick. Very pointed end, very tabular, flat end on the other side. And that, again, is another unique build. So if any of you have seen artifacts like that, I'd be interested to see them, get pictures of them, and see, you know, compare what they're like. Yeah, Don, you got a comment there?
The bottom looks like a specialized hands.
Yeah, it's there. It's the same picture there, one from the top and one from the side of the same artifact.
The one on the left, I don't know how long it is, but it was made specially to be that curve like that. And if it's 8 inches or so, probably a basket hook.
Yeah, it's more like this is centimeter scale up here, so that's like 10 centimeters. So it's like 8 centimeters long or so.
Okay.
Yeah. So you're looking at, you know, something like that. Yeah.
Then it's probably a serpent.
Oh, you think it's an effigy, maybe? Yeah, it could be.
There's an awful lot of them.
Yeah. Yeah, you got
You just mentioned basket. Is this used at all in the technology for building their canoes or boats?
I would think so, yeah. I mean, I would think some of these are built for woodworking, and it's just a matter of being able to find some evidence for that. That's kind of what we're going for, you know. And Don's got some ideas about using square versus circular cross-section awls for that. But we just need to get some. A, we need to have some experimentation, and B, we need to have some good examples of these things to that would have traces of wear, use wear on them still.
Experimentation
Right. Yeah, and we've been doing that. So
triangular square.
yeah, and just connecting that with the prehistoric artifacts is the key. Yeah.
Yeah, you use the term fishing gouge. What does that mean? Gorge.
Gorge is the right word. Sorry.
What does that mean?
Well, the fish would swallow the whole implement, and then it would turn sideways in there, in the gut, and that would catch the fish. That's the idea, I believe. Speaking of fishing, Jim's got a really nice case of fish hooks, and I have looked at 121 of them so far. Most of them are the J type of fish hook, and then we've got the circle type hook. There's a lot of different types of line attachments, lots of different individual attributes that can change between and be mixed between the different types. And there's a lot of work that could be done to see if there's patterns in those attributes geographically. I haven't been able to put all of that together yet. I found that most of Jim's were square in cross section and then just curled around to one extent or another. It really grades between the two types. When you, from the J type, you kind of widen out the bottom, and then as you widen that, the shaft or shank comes back over the hook. Yeah.
Of the 121 specimens, did any have barbs?
No, 0 barbs. Yep, these were all just straight points. Yeah, and that is a good point. They just don't have the modern barb on them. Even though the harpoons have barbs, I mean, they had that idea. They just didn't use it on fish hooks. And I think the idea is that they let them swallow the whole hook instead of trying to catch on the mouth. Yeah.
So with all these fish hooks, do you have any gaps in this collection?
I mean, if you put some of the fish hooks together, right, that would you can make a gaff out of it, right? That's,
2 fish hooks and an awl.
yeah, put them together. Actually, this hook here, interestingly, it's got string right here. Can't see it because of the fuzziness, but the string is preserved, and it's an interesting spot for string, don't you think? I mean, it's down here. It is tied right around there, so I guess that's probably not evidence for it being tied around a stick. But you know, you could use some of these straight hooks as if you put 2 or 3 of them together, you could have a pretty nice gaff, I think.
Any clues on what the string, how the string was made?
It looks like plant fiber of some kind, and I'm hoping to get it carbon dated. And when we do that, we'll look at what it is, what kind of species it is. Beyond that, I don't know. It's definitely plant fiber. It's not faunal. It's real fine stringy material. I've got some nice pictures of it, but it's hard to get on here. But anyway, yeah, it's a good question. So fishing was big, is kind of the point here. He's found 121 fish hooks in Lake Koshkonong area made out of copper. That's is a lot compared to the other tool types. All right, I talked about most about that. All right, some of the other tools here. We got 21 knives of various types, mostly A2, mostly of A2 type, and a couple of other types are found. Let's see if I got, okay. So we got just a bunch of different knives, so that adds to the cutting edge type tools. Some of the other things we found were a couple of spuds and a chisel. This is a good example of the chisel where you've got a really nice curated edge where it's been worked down. You can see it's been sharpened up probably a number of times. You've got a nice pounding edge here where you get some lipping and kind of that pounding marks beat into the back of it. So that's evidence of woodworking. All right, and then kind of bringing all this together, the glacial lake and marsh environment dominated by oak savanna. Copper is not readily available in that area. Copper is used to make stabbing points more often than cutting points. It was used to make a lot of perforators. It was definitely used to catch a lot of fish. So the primary subsistence activities consist of hunting, which I think was mainly fishing, hunting with fishing spears, and then also fishing with fishing line as we think of fishing. So a lot of fish work there. They're also doing secondary subsistence work such as manufacturing composite artifacts out of hide or out of bark or other woodworking, making baskets potentially using those awls. And one of the most important points here is that copper was fully integrated into the subsistence system and the economic system as an important utilitarian tool. Like it wasn't something that showed off how important you were. These were things that helped you get fish for the meal that night. And they were used in that way over and over again, enough to leave 121 of the fish hooks behind. And that's a large number. It's a lot more copper fish hooks than I'm guessing, and especially I haven't read about, a lot more copper fish hooks than has ever been found at any site before. So, all right, talked about that. Talking about Lake Nokomis, I've only gone through 153 total artifacts there. Sampling definitely has a significant impact of what I've found. I have looked at a lot more projectile points than anything from that area, but there's another wide variety, and in fact a wider variety of artifacts from Lake Nokomis than Lake Koshkonong. So taking the projectile points out, this is kind of the distribution that I've got. A lot of knives, not so many awls, interestingly. Maybe I just avoided the awl cases just because I couldn't take any more awls at the time. All right, so looking at projectile points. Again, we just look at edged and unedged projectile points, there's a very diverse set of projectile points there, lots of different types. So this is all the different witchery types. And you can see it's a lot more diverse than the Lake Koshkonong sample. And my hypothesis is that proximity to the resource allowed them to be a little more creative in the types of points that they wanted to make. So you see that the distribution, there's still a lot of points that aren't edged, but not quite so high a ratio there. It's not. It's more like 1-to-1 than it is 4-to-1. So a very small sample of alls, kind of an even split between A1 and A2, and then there's several punches that were found there. This one's interesting. I saw, I think Robin had one of those from, you said it was from Isle Royal, where there's kind of a notch out of the top here for some reason. Anyway, that strikes me as being very similar to that type. So that's interesting. Connection to Isle Royal there. And then a possible mandrel here. I didn't know about this tool type until I saw Doug's example where he's got a mandrel that fits into the socket of a point. I think that's what that is. It's kind of a broader, flatter, thicker awl than would be very useful for poking holes. Looking at knives. So 28 knives have been cataloged. They provide a long, durable, repairable cutting edge. So it's something to think about there. Chipstone tools are sharper and harder, but they also break, and you can't really repair them, at least not as thoroughly as you can copper. One common use wear pattern that I noticed on these knives was that there seemed to be a lot of bending and twisting right at the end of the knife, right down on the distal end, whether it's pointed or curved, it's kind of twisted. And it looks like they were using them for prying a lot. So here's an example, a little knife there, and then you can see the end is kind of twisted under right here. It's a little hard to see in that picture, but it's twisted around. It looks like somebody was prying with that and eventually kind of broke the end off in that job. So. What's that? Oh yeah, could be muscles, could be part of the butchering process too, where you're trying to get joints apart. But yeah, clamshells is a good call. All right, so more aquatic use of copper near lakes. It's an interesting idea. Several other tool types found in Lake Nokomis are crescents. The crescents are probably related to knives. These crescents, at least, were tools. He had a couple of examples of these kind of crescent. This one is actually folded over. The handle comes around a corner here, and then this handle comes up and ends, and then they're just kind of pounded together there and corroded together right there in that corner. So those are definitely utilized. These are tool crescents and not decorative crescents. But here in the same collection, and even in this same case, is a Crescent Dead's probably decorative in nature. You could see that the cutting, what would be the cutting edge, isn't really curved. It's got two flat edges in the bottom. And then if you look at it in cross section, the edge is not sharp. It's more rounded in shape. So it just isn't used as a tool. So crescents you got to be careful with deciding whether they're decorative or tools. You got to really look at a number of different factors. Digging tools. These were some interesting ones. This looks like a nice, type A1 spearhead, but these edges are about a centimeter thick. It's real heavy build on that end. So there it is from the edge. You can see that is not going to be cutting anything, though it is quite heavy. And so you may be using that to dig or mine something out of the ground one way or another. Some other digging tools here from the collection. There's another kind of pointed one, but it's got that thick edge again.
Can I say something?
Sure, yeah. You want to go back here?
I would surely say that is a reworked blade.
Yeah?
And the blade itself was much different and much longer when it was originally made.
I believe it's got a nice, even rectangular cross section.
Left. The middle one.
This guy here.
Yeah.
That's the same way. It's real thick across the center there, where usually the blades are worked down to nice flat.
And that is where they always have what I call the stout
Yeah.
weakest spot, so they make it thicker there. But that one time, that blade was 3 times as long as it is now.
That could be. All right. Sounds like a good theory. Okay, so bringing that together then, we got the Lake Nokomis toolkit. Tools from Lake Nokomis include things for hunting and fishing, digging, woodworking, tool manufacture, and decoration. This is also, I found a couple of copper billets, or what may be copper billets. We got the mostly silver type G1 spear point. It's nice to get these silver ones because they aren't as corroded, and you can see kind of the craftsmanship and the what the copper ones used to look like. There's really nice beveling on here. You can see some of the striations from grinding it into shape in the silver. It's really neat to be able to get a really good look at it. So here we got the cutting to stabbing tool ratio, which is much more like 1-to-1 than it was at Lake Kashkonong. And there's a wider variety of tool types. And they actually used a lot more copper to make more different types of tools. So the tools are heavier, a little bit heavier. They're a lot more different types of tools than in Lake Kashkonong. And so I think that's the impact of being closer to the copper source, having more drift copper available to do creative things with. All right, so comparing the two, the northern assemblage has a wider variety of tool forms. So far, the northern assemblage is more evenly split between cutting and stabbing type artifacts. Maybe some of you have a different feel for that. We could talk about that in a while. Copper is used in more specialized tasks in the southern assemblage, primarily for calorie capture and secondary composite object manufacturing. Copper was used more liberally for larger and heavier objects in the northern assemblage, and those are, so far, that's the differences I can find. The other look at if the source is the same. I'm going to, there's been a number of academics now, 3 or 4 of us, who are looking at chemical characterization of copper, trying to figure out which copper comes from where. So I'm going to look at the northern Lake Nokomis copper versus the Lake Kashkonong copper, and look to see if they're both coming from, Keweenaw, Isle Royal, further east over by Menominee, if they're getting it, most of the copper from float copper over there, or where that copper is coming from. So that's one thing I'm going to do to compare the two assemblages. We'll look at use wear, maybe look at some of the manufacturing techniques, and then of course the radiocarbon dating project that we're going to do with Robin. Should be pretty cool. And then I wanted to just make a note on collector and academic relations. I know this has been an issue in the past where academics have not always gotten along with collectors, and collectors have not gotten along with academics. And then, there's a kind of a movement afoot right now in the SAA, the Society for American Archaeologists, to remedy that situation because we don't think it's good where we can't get along. So the archaeological record is accessible and to anyone who's willing to go look at it, right? Professionals don't have, or academics don't have explicit access to it, and you guys don't have the only access to it. Anybody that wants to go look can go look. That's a fact that we need to just accept, right? Artifacts will catch people's eye. It's no crime to see and find and want to pick up artifacts. Everybody wants to do that. That's why we're all doing this. And there are more people who are interested in collecting archaeological things as a hobby than there are academics. And so the collectors will be out there collecting really cool archaeological artifacts regardless of how we feel about it. Like if we feel, oh, I wanted to find that, well, that's how everybody feels. I mean, that's not, we shouldn't be looking down on people who are doing that because it's exactly what we want to do. So there's more hobbyists out there or avocationals out there than academics, and we just need to face that fact. And then there's lots of people who have large collections from the last 150 years. All of the best, most diagnostic artifacts are probably in collections, or most of them are. And so if we don't look at those collections, we're going to miss out on how they made these tools and what they used them for. And so we've got to, as academics, need to engage with collectors and work together to learn about these artifacts rather than looking down on each other and not getting anything done. So This is kind of, I'm taking this directly from the SAA articles that were written recently, and that's kind of where the attitude is going, just so you know. If you've had bad experiences in the past, it's hopefully changing. And that's not a guarantee that everybody's going to be good to you, but I think that goes on both sides, right? Not every collector is super nice. Not every academic is going to be super nice either. There's different opinions and different things that we need to, different agendas that we need to factor into this argument. So we have, in the end, two options really. Either we can ignore collectors and their collections, and you guys can ignore, or collectors can ignore academics and the things that they put out. Or we could actually work together and be mutually educated. And I mean that very sincerely in that we've got things to teach collectors, but also you guys, or collectors, know so much more about the actual artifacts really than we do. And that's super important for us to learn from what you guys have learned. So we've got to go both ways. Yeah?
Can I ask you an outrageous, embarrassing question?
If I can reserve the right to not answer it.
So, you consider yourself an academic, obviously.
Yeah.
You have an interest in collecting. But have you ever collected? And if so, did you feel guilty?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess I could say I have. I've been to places where there's a lot of debitage, and I've picked up some of that. And I felt a little guilty and a little not guilty. I was like, yeah, it's okay. It's not really okay.
Just don't tell the others.
Yeah. Well, now it's going to be online, so whatever. And that's fine. Certainly, I understand that feeling of this is really amazing. It's been in somebody's, or it hasn't been in anyone's hand for 3,000 years. Holy cow, this is really amazing connection to humanity of the past. I 100% get that. And yeah, I've been in. I always get asked in my job when I'm out monitoring for construction crews, they always want to know, hey, what's the coolest thing you found? And I always feel bad because I know what collectors have. And they're like, well, I found some flakes one time. I just haven't found anything as neat as what you guys have collected or what the collectors have found. So I don't have a great answer to that. But no, I definitely understand the impetus to do it for sure. Yeah, Jim.
Just a comment on that. I've had an opportunity to work with a lot of really good professional academic archaeologists through the years.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had primarily, mostly all good relationships with just about all of them, and a couple that are kind of iffy.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I see that I've noted is that currently, right now, there's a greater understanding between collectors and academic archaeologists. You see that particularly within I'll call a new generation of archaeologists who are coming out that understand the importance of doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas you see as older people like myself, I guess, who are professional archaeologists, didn't really have that same outlook on it.
No.
One of the things that I've noticed in talking to some, and I'm not going to mention their names, but I know the people who are very good professional archaeologists. I know I can name three of them, and I'm sure you know, and other archaeologists here do know. They started off as collectors too.
Yeah,
But they
yeah.
understood that, the importance of that, and that's probably what got them interested in archaeology to start with. Because at an early age, they thought, oh, this is really kind of great, but we got to do more about it, and that was what really spurred their interest and their passion to carry it to the next level. And so they fully understand
The collecting side,
they
yeah.
understand the importance of collectors, but they understand the toughness to try and answer that question.
Yeah. Well, I would say, as a kid, I was very interested in all things ancient, and of course, wished I'd collect. I just didn't happen to grow up in a place where I knew anyone where I could collect. Otherwise, I would have been absolutely a collector as a kid. And as it's just my life path has not really led me into a field with loads of great stuff in it. Otherwise, I would have been out there picking it up. I'm sure I would have been. And the other thing I want to say about that is if you look back at the history of archaeology as it's developed, especially in Wisconsin, Charlie Brown, who essentially is the father of academic archaeology in Wisconsin, he worked with and appreciated and learned from the collectors, the guys who made Witchery's map. Those guys were all collectors, and he worked with them, and they're the ones who brought to his attention where sites were, where things were that needed to be preserved, especially mounds. And that's how we have today the list of sites in Wisconsin so well documented where all these mounds are at. It's all collector work. In fact, Charles Brown was the only, the collectors would go out, find these mound sites, collect things from there, bring them back and say, hey, here's what I found at such and such a place. And now those places are officially preserved burial grounds that, that can't be tampered with without permission. And that's an incredible start to the discipline. And I think if we get away from that, we're going to lose a lot. And so I think that's why we're coming back, like Jim says, this next generation is kind of coming back to saying, hey, we need to work with collectors and learn from each other rather than ignore one another. Yeah.
So the fellow who made the collection that you're using,
Yeah.
did he differentiate which site localities he was recovering from these washed out beaches?
We've got just the general Lake Koshkonong locality, yeah. He did not catalog them to specific site, unfortunately. It would have been more useful if he had. If he had done that, I'd be able to make a lot more inferences, but he didn't, so we're going to use what we got.
So your PhD will focus mostly on a typology of the material collection as a collective?
It'll, sort of, yeah, but it'll focus more on the sourcing of the copper, where were they getting it from at that point, and we don't need, site level provenience to do that. They're getting copper to Lake Koshkonong somehow. So that's going to be the interesting question, I think, the timing of it. Typology will be kind of an advantageous side part of it, I think, to help, yeah. Yeah, and that's part of the quest for knowledge here. What can we learn from collections that don't have that great a provenience, Witchery's work was all done on county level provenience, so it was helpful, and I still use it. I still use it from the 1950s, so I'm hoping to be able to expand that a little bit. What can we use more? Yeah.
On the Busty maps, there were a few locations labeled Old Copper Cemetery.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Those are those type sites. That's where the cemeteries were. It's funny that you asked it. That's all the academics would be like, those are the only old copper sites there are. This is the the Osceola burial site. This is the Ray burial site. That's the Oconto cemetery. Those are all cemeteries where there's human remains with copper artifacts buried with them. They're usually utilitarian spearheads and beads, and well, those aren't utilitarian, but usually there's spearheads, awls, and all kinds of different types of tools, and then there's also beads included with the burials.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I would like to point out, those were excavated not too terribly distant in age apart.
Yeah, this was 1946. This was 1944, 54, and this was 52, I think. It was earlier. It was in between the two. Yeah.
And there's a fourth one in Michigan.
The Riverside?
Yes.
Yeah, Riverside was right, where is it, here?
Yeah,
Something
so
like that.
they're all together and
Yeah.
geographically and in time.
Yeah.
I'd like to point out that after they were excavated, it was believed for a long time that that was the primary way copper was disposed of.
Yeah.
That it was
Yeah.
placed in graves.
Mm-hmm.
The first copper that was recovered in the United States for 150 years or more were surface finds, and they were collected mainly by old collectors who got big old collections they were proud of.
Yep.
And eventually they went to the museums.
Yep. Yep.
And they're in the museums and you can see them today.
That's where all of these big dots come from. These are essentially guys where they live, their home territories, and all of these artifacts are now in Madison,
So
wherever the heck
it
that
was
is,
assumed
down here.
that those too were burial sites, even though they were surface finds, or that a large amount of them are. What we have learned in the last 20 years from metal detectors is that the metal detectors are not recovering any from burial sites. It all comes from activity sites.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's a completely different picture than we had a few years ago.
Yeah, and that's a super important contribution, and really it's something that my dissertation is going to be getting at. Like that's where it's going. Copper is not necessarily just in cemeteries, and what we desperately need is to excavate one of these habitation sites and show, okay, here's a stack of copper and all of the other habitation materials, features, houses, all that stuff that comes along with habitation sites. We desperately need to just excavate one and publish it and so right now we've got like four cemeteries out there with copper in publications and nothing else. There's a few surface find reports about, Plager did one from Menominee, Michigan. I mean, what else is there? There's a few other surface find reports. That's essentially it. So what we need is, and not for my dissertation, but just as a discipline, we need a site that we can excavate a habitation and find copper there at the same time.
And those that have been excavated by archaeologists are almost entirely grave sites.
Yeah.
And there haven't been any excavations of copper, major archaeological excavations
No.
of copper in more than 50 years,
Yeah, and that's
70 years.
it's really setting us back because, I mean, these are super important artifacts, but we can't put them in context because we're not getting out there to do we're not focusing on those habitation sites. And we're going to need help from collectors to do that because you guys know where the sites are. Yeah, we got time? Do we have time?
We're running short on time, but just a comment, where I see the star up there in the.
Yeah. Yeah, this is Pembine area. That's Busty's, yeah.
I've been involved with some projects in that same area.
Mm-hmm.
This is just something for your information, maybe everybody else's as well. And particularly when you're trying to source locations, you're sourcing the copper. This was an interesting thing that we did. We got involved in a project in the actual Menominee River, riverbed. And we just wanted to try to see if at the base of some of the falls and in some of the shallower water, if there was any artifact distribution there.
Collecting, yeah.
What we found out was we found there actually were some artifacts that we actually did find, but what really surprised us was the amount of float copper that was in that river system.
Okay.
It was incredible how much float copper. And then we got involved in a project where we were going to, in a couple of areas, in that same area that you're talking about, where we were going to try to collect through on roadways and try to retrieve artifacts from a disturbed context on some of the dirt roads that run adjacent to the river.
Okay.
And again, we were able to recover some artifacts, but again, a surprising thing that we found was the amount of float copper.
Interesting.
That was in the glacial deposits.
And you know what the interesting thing is that Mark Hill, who is kind of leading this chemical characterization movement, has identified that area as a source, as a separate copper source.
It is.
Yeah, and even though there's not like in the ground copper lodes there, it's apparently there's enough float copper there too. Yeah, so that's interesting. That's very good for me to know because Ashkenaz copper is coming down from over there, rather than coming through the western side of Wisconsin from the Keweenaw. So that's my hypothesis for now. But thank you.
Time for one more question?
It's up to you guys. What time we got? Okay.
So I'm not familiar with these old copper cemeteries. Is it single burial or multiple burial?
Multiple burials. Lots and lots. The Osceola site is reported to have possibly in the hundreds, like 500 burials.
So this is,
And Ray is around 50. Oconto is in that range, 50 to 100, something like that.
so this suggests a continuity
Oh, yeah.
of ceremonial.
Yeah, this is the first
These
middle.
are
Yep.
not associated with mountains.
They're not associated with mounds. This is pre-mount. So this is the first time we see return to it cemeteries over and over again. Yeah. So that's, again, another very important social impact of this time period. And if we could have some habitation sites excavated from that time period, we could not only know how they died, but how they lived, which would be nice. Yeah.
Okay, so I have some familiarity with the Riverside place. I visited it.
Yeah.
157 individual burial bodies from there.
Mhm.
The other thing about Plager
Yeah,
how many
yeah.
miles it goes. The site that he excavated right on the,
Right on the river down there?
no, Lake Michigan. So
Oh, yeah.
College right across is a village habitation site.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
There was a couple of signs up saying we did this, and so that was, I think.
That's right, he did excavate that for the 92 article, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's good. I mean, he found what, he had like 20 copper artifacts from that excavation?
So, and
Yeah.
the Riverside was done in 57 or so he was not involved with that.
No, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's right, and that was a little bit down the line, but yeah, out on the lakefront.
3 miles south.
So we've got one copper habitation site excavated, and it was 20 pieces of copper. But yeah, that's something, right? That's a start. It's better than nothing, for sure. Okay, thank you for your lots of time.